Alrighty guys, so this is the video for the installation of the TORQ Locker in the Honda 300. TORQ Locker's right here. Got it in a couple days ago. Boom. Alright, we'll get more into it later, but I'm going to show you the full install process for the TORQ Locker. I'm not going to go over every step, but I'll try to put them all at least in a time lapse. So the way I do this is I remove the lower control arm bolts, 2 bolts, and then I remove the shock bolt, flip the shock up out of the way. And then I use the whole knuckles finger assembly to kind of pop the axle out of the diff. Your axle out, and then you've almost got enough room to get the diff out. Then we're gonna take the shield off, take off the 3 mounts, 1, 2, 3. And then we yank the diff out and we install the locker. Pretty easy installation. I'll show you how I do mine. I've installed TORQ/Aussie lockers in 20 different vehicles by now. They all install about the same way, which is good because the instructions for the 300 are just generic TORQ Locker install instructions. They may be updated at some point. You see, we got both the axles out, and now we're going to put a ratchet strap to hold them up out of the way. I don't mess with the axle nuts or anything, the tie rods, the ball joints, none of that. No need to mess with them. From one stud over the rack to the other stud, and that holds them up out of the way, so we have enough room to sneak the differential out. So that's another benefit to, using the method of removing the lower control arms instead of busting the ball joints. It makes the bottom bolt way easier to get to. Usually you have no choice but to go underneath here with 2 wrenches, but because those are out of the way, because the lower control arms are out of the way, you can get underneath there pretty easily. Once you get that bottom bolt out of there, don't forget to unhook your breather tube, which may or may not break because, it's an old machine. But all right, we got the vent line off. And now we can get it out of there. Pull the drive shaft out. There's the drive shaft. That's not going to be reused. Look how the thing is in awesome shape because we got the 424. And then as far as getting the diff out, there's a little bit of trick to it. Kind of pull it and turn it on its side, and then boom. Right it up. Any unnecessary damage. So 14. Again. I got right for longer, knowing that it comes all day. This is around all day. That's not this. The other up. Let me go down. Maybe you have a crack open. Hammer. There it goes. So the sound of the carrier off. It's very sort of tight. Right. So there is a shim, and it stayed right there. So make sure that stays on there. Put that to the side. And there is our awesome little tiny Honda diff. And we can just take out the carrier, look for this shim. Okay, it stayed on the diff that time, so put it down there. Put this to the side. Okay, now we're gonna take this sucker apart. Okay, before you get apart, you want to clean one side really well and right up. So you know with the grease pencil how to put it back together. And take it out. So here's your Honda stock attempt at making this thing limited slip is these clutches. So you got clutch disc, steel clutch disc, and yeah, and then you got a thrust washer. That's how Honda does from the factory. This spring thrust washer would put some force here, and when the gears would start to spin, they try to come apart a little bit. So yeah, that's your factory limited slip, which is for all intents and purposes 100% worthless if you have oversized tires. So get rid of all that. Not messing with that. Okay. Now how do we get this apart? So there's, you can see a pin through here and here. We've got to get that out. So the way to get this out is you take a hammer, put it in the vise, tap this pin all the way to one side, and then with a fairly sharp chisel you can get in here and get it most of the way out. And then once you get it to there, it's fairly easy to grab it with a pair of dikes and get out the rest of the way. So it's not like a car diff where you have a hole to punch it through. You've actually got to get a little creative, but that's the way to do it. I would not remove these bolts installing this locker. There's no need to. Just leave those alone. You don't risk upsetting them. So now you got to push the pin back the other way. And keep in mind, you are going to have to drive the pin out with a little bit of force because of that spring washer on the other side is actually loading it a little bit. So there is some force there. It's not just going to fall right out, unfortunately. All right, so my GoPro dad again, so back on the cell phone. So I tapped that pin all the way out. That's the center cross pin that gets reused. And I removed the spider gears, the spider gear thrust washers, so 2 of those, see those? And we got both of the side gears out, the side gear clutches, and the side gear spring washer. Now the instructions are pretty vague on this, so hopefully they get better, because this is like, you know, one of the first ones. But if you look closely, there are shims down here. So make sure you have those shims in place. They're on both sides of the carrier. See that shim? So leave those in place, and you're going to reuse those shims, but you're not going to reuse these big thrust washers, spring washers. The thing is, this cross pin is pretty tiny, and this piece gets reused. This is what sits in between here, and that's actually what operates the locker, is when that cam face rolls up on the cross pin, it puts force in causing these 2 ratchets to be forced against each other, causing them not to ratchet, and then you got a locker. So all the force still goes through this cross pin. And I have had these break with the Detroit gearless locker under a huge amount of abuse, but I have had it break. So if anyone has a good lead on someone who can heat treat me some of these pins and make them stronger and harder, that'd be great, because when this pin breaks, it ends up sliding out of the diff and it spins around and it cracks your housing in half. So I am a little bit worried about this pin. It's kind of tiny, but I mean the whole diff's tiny. But I have had these breaks, so that's one thing I'm worried about, one thing I'm gonna watch out for. All right, we got another battery, and we're gonna use general purpose lithium grease because it says in here to use a medium grease, so I don't want to use something super tacky like red and tacky or anything like that. And you just take the surface and apply a little bit of grease along here, and this will help it with its initial engagement and stuff like that. It doesn't say to use assembly oil, it says to use a medium grease. So that's what we're with the old Detroit gearless. It was a similar type of locker, right? It was a little lunchbox automatic locker, basically a torque sensitive locker. But the difference was you had a bunch of little clutches that would lock in when the cross pin put pressure on them, which was fine, except that it made it kind of susceptible to water and moisture issues because those clutches would like rust up and stick and all kinds of issues like that. So I put that together, squeeze all the grease out. Unlike the Aussie lockers for the trucks that have 4 springs, this only has 2. And because of the way this carrier comes completely apart, you don't have to fight it in there and you know, do the thing where you like get a pair of pliers and a little flat blade screwdriver and align the springs and all that. Because of the way this one is, you can just actually drop the springs in and drop the whole thing in as a unit, which is pretty nice. Obviously the cross pin has to go in, but other than that, you can just put it in as a unit. So we got this one assembled, we've got our shim down there in place. Just drop it in and get it centered up, obviously. Okay, and line it up so that the cross pin can come through this way. Get our cross pin, it's still nice and oily and clean. Slide that through. A little tap tap. The cross pin's through. And I'm going to put the rest of the locker in, and then I'll come back and put this pin in. So don't forget to do that. So you see how this timed? So you got to put your springs down in here, and these 2 little holes. Okay, and then you drop the locker in. The grease actually helps hold everything for you. There you go. Locker's in, springs are aligned. You turn it on its side, make sure everything's lined up good, look at both sides. Okay, great. Now we've got to put the little roll pin in that keeps the cross pin from sliding out. Get it started with just a hammer and then finish it off with a punch. Great. Get the cross pin in there, get the locker in there. It's all lined up right. That shim's still there. So now we just got to put this together and find our mark. So it all goes back together the same way. Okay. Get that kind of balanced on the springs a little bit. And voila. So now we torque everything down and measure that gap I was talking about. That I'd say is tricky is that you'd have to Loctite the shit out of these bolts. Now you're probably noticing that I'm not putting any Loctite on them, and that's because I do one better. I actually weld them in place. After I put them in, I tack weld them because I've had them back out several times, and that will destroy your differential. So I don't play with that. They still have a good amount of Loctite on them right now from last time. So I get them all started. The little crisscross action, obviously. And then I come down here and I kind of jiggle it to line these up, because you're actually tightening down the ring gear to the back of the carrier to the front of the carrier. So you want it all happy and lined up like it was before. So check your punch marks. Okay, looks good. Yeah, so the manual really should come for the locker. It should come with some more information on this. Hopefully they'll update it with like torque specs. That'd be great. But because I use the method of torquing everything and just putting a tack weld so they don't back out, I don't actually bother torquing these. I just put them to like 10 unkas with a little 1/2 inch electric. These are only 12mm bolts. Don't go crazy with it, obviously. Okay, so he's torqued, and now we've got to check the clearance in here, right? Because that's the clearance you got to measure, is the gap right there. That looks way too big, so we'll figure out what's going on. So this picture is obviously from a different locker, but it says check the gap from there to there, which we can't really see that gap because you know, this locker looks a little different, but that gap looks way too big. So just to do a real quick check, so 5/32 is pretty close. It's 0.156, which is effect within tolerance. So the gap should be about 5/32. So let's put a 5/32 in there and see. Yeah, so we're a little loose. Let's go up to the next size, which is 3/16, which I think would be too big, honestly. I'm using Allen wrenches right now just to get it close, and then I'll get the feelers out. So the gap we're at right now, actually a 3/16 fits perfect. So let's see what 3/16 comes out to. So fit 3/16 is just barely fitting. And if you look what 3/16 is as a decimal, I think it's bigger than that. So 3 divided by 16. 3 divided by 16 is 1.875, which is pretty far out of spec. So what's going on here? If you were to put these in, that would make it way too close, these two spring washers. So you could say put one of them in, but you really don't want a spring washer in this setup. That would be disastrous. You don't want something that's going to compress with this locker once it starts to engage. That's not what you want. So I think what happened is this is an outdated procedure. These pictures of this locker are totally different than the locker I have right here. So I'm guessing what's going on here is they need to update these center gap spacing specs, because everything is installed right. We do have the side gear shims in there in place, as I showed you earlier. The locker isn't actually completely disengaged. You can see where it's lined up here. So I'm going to go forward with the install, even though it's a little bit loose. It says that we should be at 0.175. We're really at 3/16 or 0.18 roughly. So that gap is a little out of tolerance, but not super worried about it because it's a four-wheeler locker, not a truck locker. So I'm not exactly surprised that there's a different tolerance there. Here we go. And you don't need to put a huge bead. You just need to put enough to where if one of these things were to start to loosen up a little bit, it won't be able to back out and completely destroy your diff. The reason you have to do this is because replacing a regular differential that has side gears and spider gears and all that with a differential that's just a ratcheting type or a clutch type is going to add a little bit of backlash just by design. These differentials always just have a little bit more backlash. So in order to help the bolts not rattle out with that extra backlash, I like to weld them in place. All right, so there you have it. The carrier is built up. You can see that I put a little weld on the corner of each bolt to keep them from backing out. And that's something I do not only when I'm installing lockers, I do that anytime I disassemble a Honda diff and I put it back together. Basically, anytime I take ring gear bolts out, I tack weld them back in on a Honda four-wheeler. I've had them come loose so many times. It's a lesson I've learned. I try to avoid taking these out at all costs, because if you don't take them out, you don't have to mess with them or worry about them. So the locker's installed, got the cross pin in, we got both of the little roll pins, we got our springs in there. You can see on both sides, got our springs in there. Method, so here's 6 feeler gauges, 0.032, 0.030, 0.028, 0.026, 0.025, 0.024, all added together give you 0.165, which is right in the middle of this range of 145 thousandths to 175 thousandths. So I'm at 165 thousandths with all these. So yes, there's several stacked, which is not the best method, but I made sure they're clean. And you can see that that slides right in. So that's the middle of the spec range. It's where you'd want to be ideally. And yeah, so pretty loose, pretty out of tolerance according to the instructions. But like I said, these instructions, nothing about them is specific to a 300. So yeah, I'd like it to be in spec, but is it the end of the world? Probably not. Will it work fine? Probably. I have put some of these together in Jeeps that had really wore out carriers, and when I put it together they were a little bit out of spec, and I called TORQ Locker and they said, yeah, that happens because Jeeps have like really loose tolerances and whatever, and they have a lot of wear issues. So they sent me some different shims. So the answer for this might be that TORQ Locker needs to start including some different shims in order to get you into spec, but it didn't come with any shims. So I'm going to put it together the way it is, and hopefully it doesn't blow up. Here's my bottom shim. Important to make sure those end up in the right spot. And we'll put this one in first, the half of the ring gear, the seat and the bearing. Beautiful. Okay, and now a little bit of ultra gray action. All right guys, time to test out the locker. So everything's fully installed. We've got the diff bolted back in, the A-arms bolted back up, axles fully inserted, fully seated. They snap into the locker well. Unlike the Can-Am with the Visco, it was really hard to get the axle seated, no issues here. And when you're in four-wheel drive, you're locked. Boom. Now you can kind of see that under some circumstances in four-wheel drive, it'll unlock and ratchet a little bit. That's because there's no torque coming from the drive shaft right now. But you will unlock sometimes in four-wheel drive to help you get around turns, but for the most part, once you're in four-wheel drive, it's fully locked. Boom. So when they both have torque coming from the drive shaft, locked. Now the cool thing is, when you put it in two-wheel drive, that's how I decided to mount mine for now. Yes, it's kind of flimsy, but it works good and it's in a nice position. I don't have to cut anything. And you gotta make sure that it's beneath the rack, so if you jump on your front rack or throw a cooler here, you don't damage this cable. So it's important that you route the cable in such a way where it's protected. I find that works best is just to route it between the breather hose and the diff, and then up here like so, not rubbing on any hard edges. I'm actually gonna probably put a zip tie to keep it off that edge. But anyways, okay, so now it's in two-wheel drive. All right, so we're in two-wheel drive, and now look what we can do. When you're in two-wheel drive and there's no torque on the pinion gear, basically on the cross pin, right? It acts like you don't even have anything going on up here. So it's really free, you can steer, yada yada yada. Now you do have some ratcheting you'll hear going around corners. Hear that? Totally normal, it'll get quieter once it breaks in a little bit and everything. Doesn't bother me at all. That's how my Can-Am is right now. So the real benefit of this lift is when you're in two-wheel drive, it's this. And when you're in four-wheel drive, it's a locker. So I'm sure I'll come up with some clever way to test it out for you guys. Only thing we're really waiting on to finish up the build is the swing arm stretch. So I'm gonna snorkel it today. I'm just gonna do a stealth snorkel like I did on my Tan 300 with actually the same exact piece of spa hose. That's my opinion on the locker. Seems to work great. boom, 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 engaged. And it seems to let you have all the steering and two-wheel drive, easy steering, mobility, everything you need. I do have one question for TORQ Locker again. Is it okay that the specs, I'm outside of that range? And if it's not okay, please mail me some shims to correct that.